From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Anne Marie Hordern.
A short-term measure to address the debt limit still has life, says the White House budget director. That drama colliding with more drama in the banking system as senators look for a path forward from this year's failures.
We'll hear from both sides of the aisle with Representatives Chrissy Houlahan of Pennsylvania and Byron Donalds of Florida.
And speaking of Florida, is former President Donald Trump setting his sights on the general election months before a primary is held?
And a new report says billionaire Harlan Crow paid for the expensive private school education of a relative of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. But will Congress respond? Kaylee, thank you so much for joining me. Joe Matthew is out today. We're so excited to have you. And I was just looking at the calendar, exactly 4 weeks to the day, to the X date. But there's no sense of urgency right now in Washington, is there? You were on the Hill all day.
No, there's not, because we're 4 weeks to the X date, but we're still 5 days away from President Biden's sit down with congressional leaders next Tuesday, May 9th. And it seems like until we get to that meeting, there is no incentive for either side to give way on their positions.
Right. Republicans, Democrats, they're waiting for their leaders to tell them this is the path forward and this is how we should act.
Yeah, it's a question of whether or not any real progress is going to be made at that meeting.
Doesn't sound like it. Joining us around the table to discuss this and much more that's happening this Thursday evening, Bloomberg's Mario Parker and Washington Bureau Chief Wendy Benjaminson is joining us today. Wendy's actually one of our biggest team leaders here. All right, let's start with the fact that no one is doing anything at the moment in Washington. So Biden has a pretty empty schedule this week and today. There was a White House lit at 2:30 p.m. The Senate went home for the weekend at 3:45 p.m. Mario, where's the sense of urgency?
You would think that we would see some scrambling, right? But both sides are trying to play it really cool right now, right? You don't want to give up leverage. You don't want, if you're the White House, you don't want to seem as though you're scrambling, that you're huddling for some type of magic or panacea here. But you could tell that the debt ceiling is top of mind for the White House. It's been at all the talking points at the press briefing. Shalonda Young, OMB director, was there today speaking about it as well. So you can see that the White House is continuing to message on it.
So you can see the White House messaging, but Wendy, can you really see the president? I mean, where has his visibility been this week and really for some time now?
We really haven't seen much of him since, I think the last time, Mario, as you were about to point out, is the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And we haven't seen him since then, and he was just joking around at that, of course, because that's all you're supposed to do. But since then, we have seen very little on his schedule, and it could be that he's there working the phones, talking to people, trying to figure something out. If he is, it would be good politically and policy-wise to tell the American people that he's doing that.
Business communities are frustrated, and usually these are the business communities that actually wrangle behind the Democrats. Has that been a surprise for the White House?
I think it has been a surprise for the White House. I think they've been... they've been surprised that he isn't more forceful about it, that he hasn't sat down with Kevin McCarthy. He's making them really, really nervous, and that's not comfortable for them.
Well, and we also have to consider that the president isn't just being the president. He also is a candidate, and he is seeking re-election in 2024. So this isn't just the invisibility of a president, but the candidate as well. How does this play in as we have this conversation around general election politics, which it seems like Donald Trump increasingly is pivoting towards, less so worried about the primary, Mario?
Yeah, look, Bloomberg economists are projecting that we could hit a recession in Q3. That's before we even get into the debt ceiling fight. No president that's running for re-election wants the cloud of a recession hanging over their candidacy at all. And so you have to figure that Joe Biden doesn't either. That's where the great leveling field is. I was speaking to a Republican earlier today who said that most polls show that Biden beats Trump in a normal situation. The problem is once you throw in a potential recession or economic fears, then that becomes a cudgel for which Donald Trump may be able to hit Joe Biden over the head with.
And this is exactly what Trump's advisors want him to do. He's about to do a town hall on a major network that he's pretty much avoided since he left the presidency. And what his advisors want him to do is really just focus on the economy. Now, It remains to be seen if Trump can do that, if he can go in with one message, right, and not try to have a little bit of a revisionist history. But if he is, what a timing for it. Banks are failing. We don't have a debt ceiling deal. Still, we have high inflation.
Yeah, and the phrase you use, Anne-Marie, is very prescient. Just looking at just the collective amnesia. Donald Trump wants us to forget that the fourth year of his presidency was mired in a recession due to his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, voters have so far given him a pass because they see who's in the White House right now. We have short memories, et cetera. So Trump's campaign is hoping that he could capitalize off of that and lay any recession, both COVID in 2021 and then anything that happens here in 2023 at the feet of Joe Biden. Meanwhile, he's just essentially squashing Ron DeSantis.
Yeah. He is, but one of the things about this town hall appearance I wanted to bring up is that Trump's campaign may be hoping, his campaign staff may be hoping he hits Biden on the economy. His ads are certainly going to hit Biden on the economy. But if there's one thing we know about Donald Trump, he will get before that camera and it will be the airing of grievances.
Yeah.
And he will say the same things he always does. He just steps on his own message. And yet, Republican primary voters will love it.
Well, on the subject of the airing of grievances, Wendy, we also know he has some grievances with New York and prosecution there, and the idea that a state judge is biased against him in this case that Alvin Bragg has brought. He asked today to move that case to a federal court, and that's just, of course, one of the legal issues in which he is mired. We know he fundraised off of it when he actually was indicted, but how does this play now and going forward?
Well, there are so many things. I think the timing is a little bit good for him because all of this is going on before people are voting. Although we do have the specter. Picture this. Iowa and New Hampshire are having their Republican primaries in January, and Trump is either on trial or about to be indicted for anything from fraud to sedition. The E. Jean Carroll sexual assault trial is still going on now. We had another woman testify yesterday. He denies it, but she said under oath that he assaulted her while she was there to report on his and Melania's anniversary. I mean, these are things that would kill any other candidate, politically speaking. And we'll just have to see if voters really want to, believe they want another 4 years of this in the White House.
The other big moment of the day is, of course, what's happening with Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. ProPublica has this new report out that money was spent from Harlan Crow to pay for the child he was looking after on his private school. Yeah. Democratic Senator Dick Durbin spoke with David Weston on Monday about whether or not the Senate could enforce an ethics code. Here's what he had to say.
In terms of actual enforcement, subpoenaing justices and stuff, that may be problematic. But in terms of establishing why Clarence Thomas, over a 20-year period of time, never disclosed these trips and whether the disclosure is required and whether he should be held to a standard of conduct that's acceptable to all other branches of government, I think that's clear.
All right, so he's talking about the trips and the lavish vacations and the jets, but now we know that there's more to this relationship. So the Democrats want a code of ethics. But the Republicans, they are forcefully backing what's going on, and they don't think that's necessary. How do you see this playing out?
Well, there's a few dynamics at play, right? While Democrats have the majority in the U.S. Senate, Senator Dianne Feinstein is ill right now, so the chances of being able to advance something out of the committee are very nil. That's what you're getting at with Dick Durbin there. Meanwhile, Republicans, John Cornyn of Texas in particular, are rallying around both Thomas and Crow. So, I mean, they're presenting a united front here to protect Clarence Thomas.
I'm glad senators have spent a lot of time rallying around Harlan Crow over the years.
It's such a good point. I'm glad, though, Wendy, that Mario brought up Senator Feinstein, because we just got a statement out from her within the last hour about how the federal judiciary confirmation process has not been slowed down in her absence, and no mention of an actual date in which she returns to Congress. Who does she feel accountable for in this moment? Because it doesn't seem like she's addressing these concerns that even members of her own party have.
Right. The California Democratic Party and its representatives have been really starting to just sort of give up on any pretense that she should remain in the Senate and have asked her to resign. There is no danger in California. It's such a Democratic state. She would only be replaced by a Democrat. almost certainly. And the thing is that with her and Clarence Thomas, this sort of shows the extent of actual power in Washington. Dianne Feinstein is accountable only to the voters of California, and they don't get a say for a couple of years. Clarence Thomas has no ethics rules, or very few ethics rules in the Supreme Court, and can only be removed by resignation, which is not in his character, or impeachment, which is as long as the House, which starts in the House, and as long as the House is run by Republicans, there's not a chance they're going to impeach him. So these two can just stay in their power seats for as long as they want.
So status quo is the takeaway. Wendy Benjaminson and Mario Parker.
Americans are feeling that erosion of how much they trust these institutions.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And speaking of status quo, we're going to talk about the debt ceiling coming up and the impending X date that continues to haunt Congress, yet no real movement. We'll speak with Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan on what's next for this debate next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
The discussions are going to be important, but the default should be avoided, and it should not be weaponized for purposes of what I see the Republicans doing. We should always sit down during the normal course of the process, through the appropriations process, to figure this out, and I'm all for that discussion.
Nevada Senator Catherine Cortez Masto speaking earlier with Bloomberg's Katie Lyons up on the Hill. Today, that was, of course, about the debt ceiling. For more, we welcome Democratic Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan of Pennsylvania. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. Looking at the calendar, we are exactly 4 weeks to the date of the X date, yet President Biden is only inviting congressional leadership to the White House next Tuesday. Doesn't give much time for Congress to negotiate a deal to raise the debt ceiling. A lot of business pressure is mounting on the president now that he needs to negotiate with McCarthy. Is that pressure growing in your caucus in Congress?
I think that's a good question, and I agree with what the senator just mentioned on your show, which is this needs to be talked about. We need to be grown-ups. We need to come together in a room and talk about the debt ceiling and how grave and serious and sober it is to cross over that debt ceiling and to default on our debts. But we need to decouple that from conversations regarding appropriations, and so we can be grown-ups. We can do both at the same time. We are, I think, waiting for President Biden and for McCarthy as well to sit down and meet, as they will in the next week or so, and looking forward with bated breath to what they are able to accomplish. But I do believe that many of us are not only encouraging of the president to do this, have this conversation, but are also working in the background to make sure that we have opportunities to solve this crisis before it finalizes in a really catastrophic end, in which we default. And that solution looks a little bit like what was put forward by a group I'm part of, which is called the Problem Solvers Caucus. And the Problem Solvers Caucus has about 60 or so members on both sides of the aisle, equally represented. And we've put forward basically a proposal that says if the conversations fail between the president and McCarthy and the four of them, then we would ask that the debt ceiling be suspended for a period of 6 months, during which time, as the Senator Cortez Masto said, we go through the normal appropriations process that's the way the government should be set up, and we hopefully come forward with some thoughtful ways of being more resourceful with the taxpayers' money. And we also put forward an independent commission, that will look into other ways that we can find to make sure that our resources are better appropriated.
Well, if the objective here is to find common ground between both sides of the aisle, Congresswoman, we know what Republicans want. They want deficit reduction. Their preferred mechanism of that is spending cuts. Why aren't the Democrats seizing on this opportunity to negotiate perhaps revenue-raising measures, something like higher taxes, something in the middle?
Sure. I think that those two things, of course, go together when you're thinking about how to look at your budget, but they don't necessarily go together with when you're thinking about the money you have already spent. And what we need to do is be thoughtful about the implications of defaulting on that debt. We have collectively spent that money already. It is owed and due, and we need to pay for it. But we also need, as you said, on an ongoing basis, to be thoughtful of the revenue and expenses that are coming out the other side, which is what, frankly, the appropriations process is all about.
You're on the House Armed Services Committee, but Avril Haines today spoke to the Senate version of that, and her concern was this. She told senators that in the case of a U.S. default, it would be, quote, almost a certainty that China and Russia would look to take advantage of the opportunity. Given your knowledge on how foreign governments work and the committees you're on, how concerned are you about how this chaos potentially brewing in the United States could be viewed against Washington?
I am concerned. I not only serve on the Armed Services Committee and heard similar conversations when those same folks sat in front of us, but I also serve on the Intel Committee. And chaos is the agent that the Russians and the Chinese are looking for. But also, frankly, the markets are looking for stability. And if they don't see stability in the U.S. dollar, they will look for it somewhere else. And that is also something that we don't necessarily want to see us cross that path. We don't really know what chaos will unfold, what Pandora's box we will open if we cross that line, and we really shouldn't be taking ourselves to that brink. And I think it's really important that we're responsible stewards here in Washington and make sure that that particular case or scenario does not unfold and we don't have to see what the consequences could be.
Finally, on the subject of geopolitics, Congresswoman, specifically the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, we, of course, had Russian reports of a drone flying over the Kremlin that was destroyed. Have you received on the committee any credible intelligence about whether or not that was a Ukrainian drone? Where do we stand on this issue?
The intelligence that I have is the same intelligence that you have, which is that it is unknown, whose drone that is. It is clear that the United States and the Ukrainians have vociferously denied any connection to that, and I believe that. In fact, I hardly ever, if ever, hear anybody calling the Russians liars with that word, and in fact, I heard that today coming out of spokespeople from the Pentagon. So I think we should take them at their word that that is true. This is, again, speaking to chaos. This is what Putin wants to see happen. He wants to see him throw ideas and controversy and chaos into the wind and see how we as Americans respond to it, how we as our allies respond to it, because all that happens when chaos unfolds is that Putin gains power.
All right, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan, thank you so very much for joining us. We appreciate your time. And coming up, we're going to turn the spotlight toward financial regulation and what Capitol Hill is looking at.
I am very worried about, the whole regional bank sector.
We need to put pressure on the regulators to regulate the bad apples.
I remain concerned because the fallout from weak regulation and poor oversight is still in the system.
New polling data on attitudes and faith in the financial sector in the wake of the latest banking crisis. We'll talk with the editor-in-chief of Gallup, Mohamed Younis, next. Stay with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
I think that banks mostly in this country are safe. I'm concerned that this Congress and the former president weakened bank safety rules. We are right now working with the Fed to re-strengthen those rules so that that banks have enough capital, that banks have enough liquidity, and that they are going through these stress tests.
That was Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, chair of the Senate Banking Committee, reacting to a new poll from Gallup saying nearly half of Americans are worried about their money in the banks. Joining us now to discuss is the editor-in-chief of Gallup, Mohamed Younis. He is here with us in our Washington studio. So 48% of adults say they are concerned about their money. Tell us more about this data, how it compares to history as well, since we have crises to compare it to.
I think that's the most shocking part of this data point is it basically is right on par with where we were in some of the darkest moments of 2008, with half of adults in this country expressing some degree of worry about the safety of their money, not only in banks, but also the question includes financial institutions at large. It's also coming at a time when we've seen declining confidence in national institutions, and banks have been right there with them. Right now, 27% of Americans say they have confidence in the banks. here in the United States. The low point back in the 2008 crisis was somewhere around 22%. So we're not very far off from where that.
And yet we keep hearing, Anne-Marie, that this isn't 2008. That is the line here in Washington.
Yeah, what you continuously hear from officials is that the banking system is sound and resilient. At the same time, we have banks that potentially are going to fail this week. What I also thought was so fascinating about the research is it came before the failures of First Republic and potentially this PacWest looking at strategic options. Does this data just get worse?
If you were to project, right, here at Bloomberg, you would have to, right? Because this poll actually coincided with the SVB and Signature meltdowns. But like you're saying, it's predating now other events, critical events, in the story of Americans' public trust in banks. It's also fascinating to me that Americans' confidence in the leaders making the economic decisions, debt ceiling, the situation with the banks, are also at a relative low, even for some of the leaders who had a really positive approval rating in the past.
Well, and we're saying Americans as a blanket phrase here, but talk about the demographics, partisan demographics, income demographics that are included in these findings.
Absolutely. And with half of the population, there also usually isn't that much variation. But what's interesting here is that there is. Republicans and independents are the most likely to express worry. But not surprisingly, but equally as concerning, Americans who are on the lower scale of the income brackets are the ones expressing the most concern.
And these are the ones that are dealing the most when it comes to things like higher inflation. They feel it the most. What I thought was also fascinating about the officials, it's not just what you normally would see, very partisan for Biden or Republican congressional leaders. Jay Powell, more Democrats have faith in him than Republicans and independents combined, yet this is a Trump-era appointee. What do you make of that data? What's going into this?
Not only that, his approval, so essentially the question is, do you have confidence in the following individual to make the right decisions for the U.S. economy? Right now, he's at 36% confidence. What's really shocking about that data point is actually he was at about 60% on that same question back in 2020 in the darkest moments of COVID, the lockdown, TARP, and all of those series of decisions. So this is a leader in a time when around this town there aren't a lot of leaders with high levels of confidence.
Yeah.
This is one that had it and lost.
But remember, he was on the Today Show. He was going out speaking directly to the American people. And now they're saying, you told us for months it was transitory.
And that's when the Fed was in supportive mode, and now they're not in that mode anymore. Just quickly, Mohamed, as we're talking about these economic issues, where does it rank on voters' priorities? We always hear it's the economy, stupid, but do other things trump it right now?
It's always the economy, Steve. Like, it really is. Historically, the economy has consistently been the number one most important issue that voters take into consideration when they go to vote.
Mohamed, thank you so much for your time today.
It's great.
Really interesting data. Mohamed Younis joining us there from Gallup. Coming up, the FDIC plans to make the big banks kick in more money than smaller banks replenish the insurance fund. We'll speak with Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of the House Financial Services next. From Washington, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. A Biden aide earlier today talking about a short-term debt limit measure being not off the table. Here with us to discuss is Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Let's get right to it. There's a lot of scramble and talk in Washington, even though I know you're on recess at the moment, about potentially a short-term extension of the debt limit, so then there's more time for these negotiations. Would you vote for that, a short-term increase?
No, I wouldn't vote for it. And let me be very clear as to why. Number one, the White House and Senate Democrats have been, frankly, messing around, hanging out, not doing the hard work. What they were, frankly, banking on is for House Republicans to not come up with an actual package to raise the debt ceiling. and they were wrong. Instead of doing the prudent thing, the fiduciary thing, and as somebody who's a former financial advisor, I understand what a fiduciary responsibility is. They didn't do that. And so now because they didn't do their homework, they want a short-term extension? I don't think so. Look, here's the key thing. The street has been saying for a very long time that Congress's ability to raise the debt ceiling is a concern. But the overarching concern is Congress's lack of ability to actually have a fiscally sustainable track record for how we're going to spend the people's money and then responsibly find a way to repay the debts that we've incurred. So the White House and Senate Democrats need to step up, do their job quickly, and not kick the can down the road.
On the subject of fiscal responsibility, I spoke with your Republican colleague in the Senate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, earlier today in the Senate hallway. I asked him whether or not revenue-raising measures should be on the table, not just spending cuts in this negotiation. Here's what he said.
I think everything should be on the table in the conversation between the President and McCarthy. I think a short-term raise is really a mistake here. And importantly, you don't go into a negotiation like this with still a lot of time left on the clock saying, give us another 30 days. I think everybody needs to recognize we need to pay the country's debts. We have enough time to do that, so they should negotiate with that in mind.
So, Congressman, it seems you're agreed on not having a short-term lift. Are you also agreed that revenue-raising measures should be on the table?
No, I don't think so. Listen, we're raising record revenue now. If you look at a percentage of our economy, the United States is raising roughly 20% of GDP in tax revenue. We've never raised this much in tax revenue in the history of the United States. So now why would we tell our innovators, our producers, our hardworking Americans, hey, you know what? We want more of your money, when the truth is Washington has a spending problem that Washington can sit down, fix, and figure out a way to ameliorate. This is one of the reasons why House Republicans have said we want to see 22-year spending cap levels on discretionary spending, and then we go from there as a way to get the nation's fiscal house in order.
Following that vote that you and your colleagues were able to get through the House and pass that bill, Speaker McCarthy joined me, and he really outlined his red lines for the president. Take a listen to this.
You know what happens with a compromise? We can get something together. It's what I sat down with the president the very beginning in February 1st. I said, Mr. President, why don't we sit down and work through it? There's two things I will not do, Mr. President. I will not raise taxes, and we will not pass a clean debt ceiling. But we can talk about everything else.
All right, so he's saying that he will not raise taxes and he will not pass a clean debt ceiling. So from that bill, what are you all prepared to cut out of? Because obviously you're going into a negotiation with more, but you're going to end up with less.
Well, let's be very clear. First of all, Senate Democrats haven't passed a bill at all. And the House and the White House doesn't have a plan at all. So right now where we are is they need to come up with a strategy for what they think is going to be palatable in order to raise the debt ceiling. I'm not going to negotiate with the media, with all due respect to you and a lot of your media colleagues. They need to come up with a plan. House Republicans are very clear. We have a strategy to curtail our spending. We have a strategy to raise the debt ceiling. And we have a strategy in order to find a way to continue to pay the nation's bills, some of which I don't agree with. Previous Congresses have encumbered us in ways that we need to reflect and change, but then we go forward. But to then say what I'm willing to give away, that's not appropriate. I've never cut any deal like that in my private life. I'm not going to start that now. Let's understand one thing that's clear. Joe Biden could have raised the debt ceiling last year when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. He chose not to do so. He chose brinksmanship. He chose to hold our treasury markets in a lurch, and now he's going to have to negotiate. So I'm with the speaker on this one. Let's figure out where we land to be responsible. But at the end of the day, we have to be careful and use common sense with the people's money. It's not our personal dollars, and that's what House Republicans are committed to.
What do you make of the individual that you've now backed to be your leader and candidate for 2024, former President Donald Trump? The debt ceiling was raised cleanly under him, and he actually said it would be crazy for anyone to want to mess around with it.
Well, look, President Trump at the time had the support of a large amount of Republicans. Our debt was a lot lower than where it was at where it is right now. We had not unleashed an inflation. Let me not say we. Joe Biden and the congressional Democrats did not unleash a massive inflation, which frankly is a tax on every American, regardless of their politics, regardless of where they are on the economic spectrum. A lot of things have changed. Right now, we're in a situation where Joe Biden, in his own budget, he wanted to spend $7 trillion next year. That's just ridiculous. Everybody knows that. So he has to actually come to the table, sit down, and actually negotiate. If congressional Democrats had done their job when they were in control of both chambers, they could have tried to fund their little initiatives that they wanted while also taking care of the fiscal health of the country. They chose not to. The country's not in a healthy fiscal place. And if you allow massive government spending to continue, the inflation, which has hurt so many Americans, will also continue. And that is not something even President Trump would agree with.
And as we talk about inflation, many members of your party, Congressman, have blamed the inflationary policies of this administration, the higher interest rates that have resulted from that, as a reason for the bank failures that we have seen. It seems that more banks are teetering on the brink as we speak, several regional lenders in question. We also had a Bloomberg scoop out just a few hours ago that the FDIC is looking at hitting the big banks with the fees to refill the deposit insurance fund. Do you sit on the House Financial Services Committee? Do you agree with what the FDIC may be proposing here? And would you support larger reform to the deposit insurance fund? Would Congress vote on it?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, I'm not assigning blame to Joe Biden. I'm assigning the appropriate responsibility. His American Rescue Plan created a labor shortage in our economy, which then created this inflation that's hurting every American. Anybody who's sensible and understands economics knows that. So that's number one. Number two, no, I don't support modifications to FDIC insurance. The issue we have here is that some of the regional banks were long treasuries because they didn't really understand or realize that what was going to happen with interest rate moves because of Joe Biden's reckless economic policy. But here's number three. I have a serious question about what Mary Daly has done with the San Francisco Fed. The banks that have failed, the big ones, I know Signature Bank is in New York, but First Republic and SVB, those are in the San Francisco Fed Bank. So what's actually happening with supervisory controls with respect to the Federal Reserve? I want to actually see the notes from the regulatory reviews of these banks and what the response was from bank leadership. And listen, you're not just talking to a congressman. I worked in community banking before I got to Congress. So I understand that the regulators do have an impact on the corporate boards of these banks and how they choose to compile their bank balance sheets and what that looks like, either from the balance sheet or from the deposit base. So what was actually going on in these regulatory reviews? That's a major question that needs to be answered before we start talking about more capital or new regulations.
All right, great to get the perspective of both a congressman and former community banker, Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, 4 Proud Boy leaders convicted of a seditious plot over January 6th, plus Trump seeking to move his criminal hush money case to federal court. We'll have that conversation coming up next with our political panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. Ukraine is demanding a complete effort to punish Russia for its aggression and to prevent repetition. President Volodymyr Zelensky made an unannounced visit to The Hague today. Zelensky welcomed efforts by the International Criminal Court and the creation of the list of damages inflicted by Russia during the 14-month-old war. He called it a step forward, but he urged the court to set up a full-fledged tribunal to punish Moscow. France's moderate CFDT union is warning it will fight to the end against President Emmanuel Macron's plan to raise the retirement age to 64. Union head Laurent Berger told French television today the next step is a day of nationwide strikes on June 6. That's aimed at ramping up the pressure on 2 days before the National Assembly weighs a proposal to repeal the pension law. A second attempt to hold the referendum on the measure was rejected Wednesday. And the NFL is being investigated by California and New York over allegations it fostered discrimination and harassment in the workplace. New York Attorney General Letitia James and her counterpart in California announced they've begun a probe into the NFL's workplace culture and practices. Both attorney generals cited a New York Times report in which more than 30 former female employees complained of discrimination and retaliation after they went to human resources at the league. iPhone maker Apple posted revenue and profit that both topped estimates in its earnings report today. The results suggest the company is bouncing back from a slump impacting the smartphone industry. The Cupertino, California-based company also announced plans for $90 billion in stock repurchases. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
After 3 trials, we have secured the convictions of leaders of both the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers for seditious conspiracy, specifically conspiring to oppose by force the lawful transfer of presidential power. Our work will continue.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. The former chairman of the far-right Proud Boys, convicted of a seditious plot to bar the peaceful transfer of power on January 6 when rioters attacked the U.S. Capitol. For more, let's bring in John Sitalides, geopolitical strategist for Trilogy Advisors, and Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining Kaylee and I this evening. So now we have this Proud Boys convicted, 4 of them, as well as the chairman. What does this do, given the fact that everyone continues to, when they talk about January 6th, lay a lot of that blame on the individual who was ginning up the crowd before they walked over there?
I mean, I think it continues to be embarrassing for the former president. I mean, and there were other individuals that were ginning up the crowd, including Senator Cruz. And I don't think necessarily that maybe Cruz didn't expect that they were going to go over and do that. But it's good to see that these people are being held accountable for the actions. Those of us who were there and had friends inside the Capitol, it was a traumatic experience. It was a very sad day for the country. And, the justice is taking its course.
Well, and of course, when we talk about the man in question that Anne-Marie was referring to, the former president who would like to be president again, John. So how does this factor into the politics around 2024 when you have the January 6 questions hanging over his head? What is going on in New York? Questions in Georgia as well. I mean, a slew of legal issues.
Right. Well, I think it depends on which audience we're talking about first. So when it comes to Republican primary voters, Donald Trump is anywhere from 25 to 35 points ahead of Governor DeSantis in almost every poll. Mm-hmm. So it seems like the Republican base is still with President Trump. And as he said when he was a candidate in 2015 or 2016, if he shot somebody dead in the middle of Fifth Avenue, he wouldn't lose a single supporter. So I think that base is pretty much with him. Now, will this affect him in the general election if he wins the primary? Very much so. I mean, certainly he's the number one reason that Democrats will vote. I think more than supporting Biden, it'll be against Trump. But there'll be a large number of never-Trumpers in the Republican Party, especially suburban women, as we saw in 2020. And this will only reinforce their sense that he's not fit to be president. So I think we need to see what happens in the primary process first. And I don't think this will have a very, very significant impact on Republican voters for the most part during the primaries.
But in the primary, Trump is basically saying, nothing to see here for me. I'm not getting involved. I'll see Joe at the debate stage. Mm-hmm. Is that the right way he should be handling this?
I don't know if it's the right way, and I think we'll see what happens when he has this town hall meeting or this town hall event next week, because I have the sense that he's going to try and portray Joe Biden as an extraordinarily corrupt president. He'll bring up the Hunter Biden laptop issue. He'll bring up a whole host of charges, and he'll have a live audience, and I think he'll completely ignore the reporters or even the questioners from the town hall, and try to put the burden on Joe Biden as somebody who is not worthy of being president, and then couple that with what he considers to be an exceptional economic record before COVID hit, and try to remind voters of what things were like in January of 20.
Well, on the subject of economics, we have this slew of issues that seem to be piling up. Already you had concern around a recession. Now we have banks that some of them still don't look very stable. We have this question of the debt ceiling and whether the U.S. is going to default on its obligations at some point this summer. How poorly does that play for the Biden administration that is saying, I'm not going to negotiate on the default and the banking, or on the debt ceiling rather, and the banking system is sound and resilient?
I mean, I think that the president has been and should be realistic about the challenges facing Americans. I think maybe learned that lesson in the very beginning when he was talking about inflation. People were feeling that. And I think that he's pivoted and started to do a much better job in that way. The president has had some significant accomplishments, and it's like people focus on the things that are going poorly. Specifically on the debt limit, though, and I've mentioned this before, right now, Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans are holding this hostage. I worked in Congress for members who cared about this issue very much, and that is irresponsible. However, they do have control of the House. So, the conversation needs to happen. The four are going to the White House. President Biden did open that door, made the invitation. You have moderate members of the Democratic Party like Jared Golden of Maine who are talking about, like in Politico this morning, saying, hey, guys, we all need to come together. We need to have a conversation. He's right.
Well, he made the offer for the conversation next week, which gets us even closer to the potential next stage.
Today is a month, and Karine Jean-Pierre, speaking to reporters, it sounds like Biden just plans to have them in and give Kevin McCarthy a lecture. This doesn't feel like it's going to be a back and forth.
You never know what happens behind those closed doors.
You'll find out.
Yes, you will.
Everybody stay tuned for May 9th. That's the date we're all waiting for. You guys sit tight. Coming back, we're going to have more on our political panel to discuss the latest developments surrounding Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and his relationship with billionaire Harlan Crow. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Billionaire Harlan Crow paid private school tuition for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's grandnephew. That's according to a ProPublica report from today. That adds to a string of revelations about benefits received by Thomas from Harlan Crow. Our political panel is back with us. John Stidolides, geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors, and Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. John, as I said, this is just another item on the list. When does it become one strike too many, even for Republicans?
I doubt it will be. And it won't be a matter of Republicans. It'll be a matter of the Supreme Court. And I see the Chief Justice is looking to protect the prerogatives of the court. That's why he doesn't want to testify in a congressional hearing. And Justice Thomas, those of us who were old enough to remember his hearings in 1991, is about as tough as they come in this town, regardless of whatever his critics may say about him. I think what you'll also see is a campaign of whataboutism, so that Justice Sonia Sotomayor had a $3.6 million book advance with Penguin Random House, and they had business before the court. No one ever made an issue of that. Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to Israel.
That was public. That was public, right?
But when we talk about quote-unquote conflicts of interest, because Harlan Crow apparently had no interest, no business before the Supreme Court.
At one point, his real estate
extraordinarily remote. And Open Secrets has been through this. They did a report about 4 years ago that reported about 2,000 to 6,000 trips and other types of gifts by billionaires and by private institutions for justices. So I think this is a matter of trying to get Justice Thomas to resign before next year and look to see if the White House can get another quote-unquote liberal or favorite of Joe Biden into the White House. I hope it doesn't mean that they think that they're going to lose the election next year. Why put this kind of pressure on Justice Thomas now? I don't see it.
Well, you're talking about it's not going to change until the Supreme Court decides they want to have a code of ethics. But some senators are saying that actually more needs to be done. Senator Whitehouse on Tuesday calling for an ethics probe. Take a listen.
Until there is an honest ethics process at the Supreme Court, these messes will continue. The court has conclusively proven that it cannot police itself.
So what happens? Do the Democrats just make this a 2024 issue?
I mean, I don't think it's going to be a kitchen table 2024 issue, but I think the Democrats are going to continue to talk about it, and I think that they should. So you have, congressional staffers on Capitol Hill who are subject to much more stringent oversight and ethics rules than the Supreme Court is. And I think it's troubling. So, I think shining a little bit of light on that, I agree. I don't think probably anything's going to get done. But pressure should be put on the justices to disclose these types of things.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about geopolitics. I know this is really your wheelhouse. I had a story out today about two top officials going to Saudi. Next week, though, Blinken later in June. But next week, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's going. The UAE, Saudi, India, and the United States at a table. That's what this meeting is. I'm dubbing it the new quad. What do you make of this?
I wish somehow I could say this is going to come to fruition. I think we're still in a very difficult place with Riyadh, and I think that then candidate Joe Biden talking about Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, as a pariah and looking to sort of isolate Saudi Arabia in U.S. foreign policy, has burned some bridges. I think it's good that the White House is trying to restore that relationship. But remember, Joe Biden went to Saudi Arabia in June of last year, asking the Saudis to ramp up production and get gas inflation down. And bin Salman cut production in October. They cut it again in 2 months ago after talking with Vladimir Putin. So I think there's also some concern that bin Salman is looking to find a way to hedge American policy in the region. And I think we're very nervous, and rightfully so, about the Chinese deal to build rapprochement between Saudi and Iran. And I think we want to make sure that we're clarifying the relationship so that the Saudis know we have their backs.
But to John's point, even though they cut, I think the Saudis are vindicated. Look where oil is trading, right, Kayleigh?
Sub 70.
All right, our thanks to our panel, John Sitilides and Kristen Hahn, for joining us this evening. That's all we have for today. Kayleigh, thank you so much for joining
Thanks for having
Balance
me.
of Power. We'll be back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.